You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us.
Hi, I'm Annie from the US.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you're listening to your favorite international podcast. The podcast hosted by two women who never met in real life.
We're back. Happy New Year. We missed you. We have a lot of fun and exciting new things and cases planned for 2025. One thing that we're looking forward to doing is a change that we've got coming to Patreon, right, Johanna?
Yes. I don't know. It's something like Fresh Hell After Dark.
Fresh Hell After Dark. Yeah. So basically...
Or maybe we're thinking of a better name.
We're going to... Yeah, that sounds naughtier than what we're planning. What we're planning...
it's a work in progress.
It's fine. So what we're going to start doing, because I spend so much time reading into old cases and old histories and things like that, we thought it would be fun to pay attention to some of what's going on in terms of crime today. So we're going to start watching these really well-known and popular crime documentaries, series, dramatic reenactments, I guess, sort of things. And we're going to discuss them with each other as we watch them.
Absolutely.
And,
yes.
Give you all our thoughts.
And we're going to start with the TV show Candy, about Candy Montgomery.
I know nothing about this, so
it's going to be interesting. So keep an eye out on Patreon, and we're going to tell you more as we get going with it and when the first episode is out there.
Yeah, that's right.
Anyway, we're back from our holiday break, as you might have noticed now, and over the holidays, I came across a couple of articles that inspired me to finally tackle this topic for us. And it will be a 3-part episode, and I'm talking about human oddities exhibitions, sideshow performances, exhibitions of the unusual, or, as it used to be called, freak shows.
Before we jump into this episode, we want to take a quick moment to acknowledge the language that we're going to be using in these episodes. The term freak is offensive by today's standards, and rightly so. It dehumanizes individuals who are often treated as mere objects of curiosity for exploitation. However, for the sake of historical accuracy, we will be occasionally using terms like freak show or freaks, as these were the commonly used terms during the time period that we're discussing, especially as we're quoting historical sources. This is a really sensitive topic. This whole topic it's tough. It touches on issues of exploitation, ableism, racism, and inequality. And our goal in these episodes is to look at the history of these so-called freak shows critically and compassionately, and recognize the pain and humanity of those who were involved, while also exploring how these performances reflected the society of the time. As always, our goal is to honor the people whose lives were impacted by these shows and to shed light on their stories with respect that they deserve. There are dozens, hundreds of stories like these. We're only going to be touching on a couple. But I think it's important to remind ourselves and our listeners, beyond the fun and glam, what was really going on and what people really survived in these situations.
I think this is, again, one of these topics where you could do a whole podcast, and I'm sure there exists probably one.
Yep.
When we think of freak shows, our minds often go to the glitzy, garish spectacles of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the kind of things you might associate with P.T. Barnum, and don't worry, we'll get to him soon enough. But the truth is, these shows have much deeper roots, and the fascination with so-called human oddities is as old as humanity itself. And I think, like we do it over here, let's start with the origins of these spectacles before we get into P.T. Barnum's life. If you listened to us for a long time, you already know that humans have always been drawn to what is unusual or different, for better or for worse. And we know that people used to watch hangings. They went to murder houses. Heck, they even made picnics while watching ongoing battles. These have all been things in the past. People like to be entertained, but throughout history, the world has mostly been lacking in the entertainment department. There was no TV to binge watch or radio to listen to music whenever you felt like this is something brand new, that you can listen to music whenever you want to. There was no cinema, no streaming, no books, and most people couldn't read anyway. And let's be honest, after listening to Uncle Günther's riveting story for the 1 millionth time about how he once traded a goat for 2 barrels of meat at the village fair, you'd probably rip your own hair out and you'd probably pay good money to see something a bit more unusual as well. If you go back to ancient times, and I'm talking thousands of years here, people with physical differences were often viewed as omens, divine signs, or even gods in some cultures. In Egypt, for example, there are records of dwarfism being celebrated in royal courts. Dwarfs, or individuals with conditions like achondroplasia, were often employed as entertainers or servants, but they were also seen as symbols of good fortune. That's right, your unique appearance could possibly land you a job in the pharaoh's palace, which is definitely one way to climb the career ladder. And I'd say for many people, maybe the only way to climb the career ladder.
And by the way, achondroplasia is a genetic condition and the most common cause of dwarfism. It occurs when there's an issue with cartilage turning into bone during development, particularly in the long bones of the arms and legs. People with achondroplasia usually have shorter stature, disproportionately shorter arms and legs, and a larger head relative to body size, as well as distinctive facial features. Despite these differences, intelligence and lifespan are typically unaffected, though there can be some medical complications like spinal issues and joint problems. Things weren't quite as rosy in other parts of the world. In ancient Greece and Rome, people with disabilities or unusual appearances were often viewed through a more exploitive lens. Take Ephialtes, for example, the man who betrayed the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. According to some accounts, his actions may have been fueled by bitterness tied to his rejection by Greek society, potentially due to a physical difference. It's a reminder that back then, physical appearance was often used as a way to judge someone's character, for better, or, as was more often the case, for worse. So, at this time, if you had been born with differences such as dwarfism, you would have been used perhaps as a court jester, sold into slavery, or worse, forced to fight in gladiatorial games. And if that wasn't grim enough, in some societies, physical differences were seen as a curse, leading to ostracization and even infanticide. So, yeah, the humanity track record here is complicated. It's not great. Let's fast forward a bit to the medieval period, and we see this fascination with human oddities take on a new dimension. During this time, people with unusual appearances or abilities were often displayed at fairs, markets, and religious festivals. These events weren't just about food and music, though I'm sure there were plenty of both. They also featured performers and curiosities.
Yeah, and let's not forget about royal courts during this time. Monarchs and nobles often kept court jesters, court dwarfs, or other individuals with physical differences for their entertainment. Could even be the complete opposite. There were people who had giants, for example, so very tall people.
That's right. Yes.
It was all about status, so showing that you could afford the most unusual or exotic individuals as part of your entourage. And one of the most famous court dwarfs was Geoffrey Hudson, who served Queen Henrietta Maria of England in the 17th century.
Hudson, also known as the Queen's Dwarf, or Lord Minimus, stood just over 18 inches tall. That's about 46 centimeters. When he first joined the court at the age of 7. Apparently, he had a growth spurt later in life and would reach a height of 46 inches or 118 centimeters. But don't let his height fool you. Geoffrey was no passive plaything. He was known for his sharp wit, which he often used to disarm critics. There's a famous story of someone at court mocking his height, likely expecting him to laugh along. But Geoffrey, always quick on his feet, replied, quote, "I may be small, but you are closer to the ground than I am when you are on your knees." End quote.
Kind of makes me think of Tywin
Exactly.
from Game of Thrones. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That kind of clever retort silenced the critic and showed that Geoffrey was far more than a novelty. In fact, he became something of a court favorite, participating in masques, performing theatrics, and even dueling. In one particularly infamous incident, he fought a man to the death over an insult. This wasn't just a man with unique stature, this was someone who commanded respect, one way or another. Very Tyrion Lannister.
Yeah, and in the 16th and 17th century, Europe's obsession with the unusual began to take on a more organized form. This was the era of so-called cabinets of curiosity, so essentially private museums for the very wealthy people. These cabinets would feature all sorts of rare and unusual items, from taxidermy animals to human remains, and yes, sometimes even living people. If you've ever watched a horror movie where someone finds a creepy old collection of oddities, that's essentially what these were.
There's a book in the Pendergast series called The Cabinet of Curiosities, which is just, if you haven't, I've mentioned it before on the podcast. If I had Powerball money, I would absolutely have a cabinet of curiosities. But an ethical one, you know.
This is where we see the beginning of what we might recognize as the freak shows. Wealthy collectors and exhibition organizers realized that there was good money to be made by displaying these human curiosities alongside other rarities. The public fascination with the unusual was growing, and the idea of paying to see something or someone you'd never encounter in your daily life became a booming business. Also, I think because other parts of the world started to get more explored, and let's not forget, people couldn't really travel back then. People didn't have a TV to see documentaries or go onto the internet to look at photos. So I think it's very understandable that people wanted to see things they've never seen before.
Absolutely.
And it's worth noting that during this period, there was a lot of crossover between entertainment and pseudoscience. Displays of the so-called human oddities were often framed as very educational. Doctors and scholars would give lectures of anatomy or physiology while people like ooh and ah and gawked at the person standing or sitting on stage. Can you imagine? It sounds a bit more dignified than being paraded through a market square, but let's be honest, the intention was still largely voyeuristic. So what does this tell us about society at the time? For one, it reflects a deep fascination with difference or different things, but also there's always been a tendency to exploit it. Whether in royal courts, market squares, or lecture halls, the individuals on display were rarely, never I'd say, almost never, in control of their own narratives. And that's a theme we'll see time and time again as we move through the history of the so-called freak shows.
So now let's move on to the 18th and 19th centuries, pretty much the heyday of traveling freak shows. They began to take on a more recognizable form in the Victorian era. This was the era of traveling fairs, circuses, and exhibitions, where human curiosities became a central feature. These events brought spectacle to towns and villages, offering entertainment to the masses in a way that had never been seen before. It all started with local fairs, which were already popular gathering spots for trade, food, and fun. The organizers soon realized that adding a little bit of, let's call it a unique flair, could really pull a crowd. By showcasing performers with unusual appearances or talents, they turned these fairs into full-blown spectacles. And then came the circuses. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the rise of traveling circuses that crisscrossed Europe and America, bringing exotic animals, daring acrobats, and yes, sideshows featuring so-called freaks to audiences far and wide. These traveling shows were perfect for the industrial age, with railroads and new forms of transportation making it easier to move performers, animals, and equipment from town to town.
It's so fascinating for me to always see how all these things are connected in a way.
Mm-hmm.
How traveling circuses became more important because of the railroad. the railroad tracks that were laid all through the United States, for example, the westward expansion. So that's part of what made these things so successful. But it wasn't just that, and it wasn't just the performances, it was also the marketing. Early promoters were masters of hype. They used bright, bold posters. I think we can all picture them in our head. Outrageous claims, and then also the word of mouth buzz to sell tickets. If you thought clickbait headlines were bad, you should have seen some of these advertisements. It's like, behold, the hairy woman. See the half man, half wolf. Or my personal favorite, alive, real mermaid discovered. Step right in. Spoiler alert, it was usually a monkey skeleton sewn to a fishtail. But hey, people paid to see it anyway. One of the most famous early promoters was not P.T. Barnum. It was a man named Philip Astley, an Englishman often credited as the father of modern circus. In 1768, he opened his first riding school in London, where he showcased impressive horse riding tricks. But Astley was no fool. He quickly realized that audiences didn't just want to see like equestrian stunts. They wanted variety. They wanted a show. And so he expanded his performances to include acrobats, like tightrope walkers and clowns, and eventually sideshow acts. Astley's innovation wasn't just the variety of performers, it was the format. He was the first to use a circular performance space, the circus ring, which allowed audiences to see the action from all sides. And that same 42-foot ring is still the standard in circuses today. And while Astley's focus was primarily on daredevil acts and comedic entertainment, the addition of human curiosities, what we'd later call freak show acts, was inevitable. Audiences couldn't get enough of these living wonders. So while Astley's name isn't as well known today, his influence on the circus and by extension the freak show is undeniable. Without Astley, we might not have the big top entertainment culture that shaped the 19th and early 20th century.
The traveling freak shows and circuses became cultural events, drawing massive crowds wherever they went. But behind the bright lights and the hype, there was often exploitation, as the performers rarely saw much of the money their unique appearance earned for others. I think it's important to talk about how people actually ended up in those shows, because the truth is, this was, for the most part, not a glamorous choice, despite how many promoters at the time would sort of try to frame things.
Yeah, it's mostly not, I ran away with the circus.
No.
To live a free and independent life.
That's right. For many, it was really a last resort. Imagine being born into a poor family in the 1800s, and you have a physical difference. Maybe dwarfism, maybe gigantism, could be any number of dozens and hundreds and thousands of different conditions that would set you apart from someone else. Families in desperate poverty sometimes saw the freak show as the only way for their child to survive. In those cases, parents often sold their children to promoters, not because they didn't love them, but because there weren't any other options.
It's one less mouth to feed, and one day the parents will die, and you want to know that your children are kind of taken care of, that they can fend for themselves in a way. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And I'm sure there were cases where families were all too happy to sell a child. We're not pretending that that was never the case, but it's unfair to paint all parents in that situation, because in many cases they were really doing the best they could.
I think that the reason why we want to bring this point home is because very often we hear, well, people back then had like a gazillion children. They didn't really care about their kids. They didn't care when the kids died. And that's just not true.
No.
That's not true.
Nope. It was exactly the same as it is today. They were just as devastated when they lost a child as we are today. It's just happened more frequently. Doesn't mean it's less painful. And then, of course, there's this darker side, this very dark side, where individuals were trafficked or forced into freak show industry. Promoters, especially in the 19th century, so the 1800s, were known to exploit vulnerable people. They would sometimes outright purchase people or even kidnap them. And this was especially true for people from non-European backgrounds, who were displayed as exotic curiosities to feed the Western obsession with anything that was other or different. And we're going to talk more about some of the most heartbreaking stories. But not everybody in freak shows was trafficked or forced. Some people indeed saw these performances as a chance to earn a living or gain independence. But even in cases like this, performers rarely had full control over their career or finances.
I think that's also because these people lived on the fringe of society. They were even less protected by laws, by regulations. I mean, I'm not naive. Obviously, in the 19th century, there was almost no workers' protection, for example, no laws to protect people working on fields as farmers, as beginning of the industrialization. But if you're living on the fringe of society, you're even less protected.
That's right. Absolutely.
Even less people care about you.
Yeah. And for many of these people, especially those with disabilities and conditions that meant that they really couldn't do a traditional job, right? So it's one thing if you're born with a challenge of some kind or another, but you're able to adapt and do at that time, what would have been a traditional job, right? Factory, farm. This is probably before factory, actually.
Maid.
So yeah, cleaning, scrubbing, this sort of thing, animal husbandry. If you're not able to do that, then freak shows were really, truly a way to survive in a world with just no safety nets, like you just said, right? The stage might have been the only option to avoid starvation. And while life in a freak show was far from ideal, some performers did find community and acceptance among their fellow acts, which was something they didn't always get in society at large. And I think this is the part that's often promoted, right? That's the part that current storytelling likes to focus on, the sense of community, the sense of family found.
Gobble one of us.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that at the same time, these people were being taken advantage of. And of course, we can't forget the way these shows really exploited racial and cultural differences. Non-European performers, so anybody not white, right, were displayed as wild savages or the living link in the evolutionary chain, right? Dehumanizing labels meant to attract paying audiences. And of course, at this point, it's impossible to ignore the very real existence of the so-called human zoos, which lasted well into the 20th century. While freak shows often focused on individuals with physical differences, human zoos commodified entire cultures, turning people from colonized regions into living exhibits for Western audiences. It's actually something that I don't think is taught very often in Western history and schools. So take the 1889 Paris Exposition, for example. This World's Fair included a so-called, quote-unquote, native village where people from French colonies were put on display, forced to live in staged huts, and to perform, quote-unquote, traditional rituals for visitors. This wasn't about education. This wasn't about cultural exchange. They were all about feeding into colonial stereotypes of exoticism and savagery, making these individuals seem more like props than people.
Yeah, because I want to say, if it would have been about showing different cultures, like, for example, we take this group of Austrians and we send them to Japan, because Japan in the 19th century has never seen somebody yodeling, for example, and then they're gonna send some dance groups over here, then that would have been educational, right?
Correct.
But this is not what that was.
No, this was, and it wasn't just France doing this. France, England, all of the big colonial powers.
Everywhere.
It's bad
Germany.
enough to have people come in and destroy your thousands of years of civilization and to dehumanize you, but then to actually more or less kidnap you, take you back to their country, and then force you to perform like a trained monkey is what's happening here for the amusement of the people who have just taken your home. It's abhorrent.
Even monkeys shouldn't perform.
No, they shouldn't.
It's all
but
bad.
You know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I mean like the cymbal monkey, nothing crazy. One of the most infamous examples of this was the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair in the United States. This event featured over 1,000 people, including the Igorot people from Philippines, who were portrayed as primitive savages. They were pressured to perform rituals such as eating dog meat, which was sensationalized in the media to justify American colonization of the Philippines. Visitors flocked to see these uncivilized displays, which were carefully curated to reinforce racist ideologies. And if you think it couldn't get any worse, let me tell you about Ota Benga, a Congolese man who was displayed in 1906 at the Bronx Zoo in New York City. A zoo. He was placed in the primate exhibit alongside chimpanzees and orangutans in order to emphasize racist theories about evolution and the so-called missing link. He spent days in a cage, enduring the jeers of visitors. It is hard to even wrap your head around the cruelty of it. Belgium and Germany staged similar ethnological expositions, and shockingly, at the 1958 Brussels World Fair, Congolese people were still being displayed in what was billed as a native village. That's less than 70 years ago. As we talk about this history of freak shows, it is impossible not to see them as part of a broader pattern of exploitation in the name of entertainment.
Yeah, and let's be honest, there is still so much exploitation ingrained in the entertainment industry to this day. But I think that's a discussion for another time, but it's still there. It's still there. Obviously, it looks different today than it did 70 or 150 years ago, but there's still a lot of exploitation. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, definitely.
Speaking of spectacle, no conversation about the history of freak shows would be complete without diving into the story of the man who turned exploitation into an art form. Phineas Taylor Barnum. Love him or hate him, but there is no denying his impact, and his story is as unbelievable as the acts he promoted. The most interesting and most entertaining source is definitely P.T. Barnum himself. Much like Alan Pinkerton, he too wrote an autobiography. If you want an interesting read, I can highly recommend. But be warned, much like Alan Pinkerton's The First Private Eye, we can assume that Barnum's book is, at times, mostly, a teeny tiny bit exaggerated.
I'm shooketh. Are you telling me that The King of Humbug was not entirely factual?
Right, it's to be expected. But it really is a fun read, really. I laughed a lot while reading it. And it still gives some great facts and a lot of valuable insight into BT's way of thinking. By the way, he wrote a couple of books, one of them titled The Art of Money Getting, which I find so funny. It's not the art of money making, it's the art of money getting. And that was something he knew of. Anyway, his autobiography has had several titles over the years. It went through several editions and updates during his lifetime alone, each with slightly different titles to reflect new content or appeal to a broader audience. Among the most notable titles was The Life of P.T. Barnum. Then came The Life of P.T. Barnum, including his Golden Rules of Money-Making, 1859. Then Struggles and Triumphs, a 40 years recollections of P.T. Barnum in 1869. And then he held it very simple, The Autobiography of P.T. Barnum. His books were as much a marketing tool as they are a memoir, and yes, it is widely acknowledged that Barnum exaggerated many, many details, true to his reputation as the master, the king of humbug. Historians view it as part fact, part fiction, and entirely on brand for a man who never missed an opportunity to promote himself.
So let's start at the beginning of Phineas Taylor Barnum's story. He was born on July 5th, 1810, in the small town of Bethel, Connecticut. Barnum's family wasn't wealthy, but they weren't exactly destitute either. His father, Philo Barnum, was a jack of all trades. He farmed, worked as a tailor, and ran a general store. His mother, Irena Taylor, was a homemaker and the one who managed their growing household. Phineas, who was named after his maternal grandfather, was the eldest of 5 children, so you can imagine money must have been tight. From an early age, Barnum was known for being clever and ambitious, traits that would become his trademark later in life. He was quick with numbers, loved to barter, and had a knack for sniffing out a good deal. He was one of those kids who saved every penny they made. He often told stories about how, as a child, he sold snacks and homemade cherry rum to local soldiers, proving he was already an entrepreneur at heart. And yeah, cherry rum, because apparently selling booze to soldiers as a kid was fine back then. That was fine.
Well, at least they didn't spend their whole day on social media.
That's right.
Kids just living in the moment, selling booze to soldiers.
The good old days. There are 2 stories from his childhood that we found especially interesting, and they show what kind of kid he was, but also what kind of family the Barnums were. The first one is from his first trip to New York City. He had been hired by a local cattle farmer to help drive cattle into the big city. Exciting for any young boy, and here's what he had to say about it. Quote, "At daylight the next morning, I started on foot in the midst of a heavy snowstorm to help drive the cattle. Before reaching Ridgefield, I was sent on horseback after a stray ox, and in galloping, the horse fell and my ankle was sprained. I suffered severely, but did not complain lest my employer should send me back. We arrived at New York in 3 or 4 days and put up at the Bull's Head Tavern, where we were to stay a week while the drover disposed of his cattle. It was an eventful week for me. Before I left home, my mother had given me $1, which I supposed would supply every want that a heart could wish. My first outlay was for oranges, which I was told were 4 pence apiece. And as 4 pence in Connecticut was 6 cents, I offered 10 cents for 2 oranges, which was of course readily taken, and thus instead of saving 2 cents, as I thought, I actually paid 2 cents more than the price demanded. I then bought 2 more oranges, reducing my capital to 80 cents. 31 cents was the charge for a small gun which would go off and send a stick some little distance, and this gun I bought. Amusing myself with this toy in the barroom of the Bull's Head, the arrow happened to hit the barkeeper, who forthwith came from behind the counter and shook me and soundly boxed my ears, telling me to put that gun out of the way or he would put it into the fire.
Can you imagine nowadays somebody boxing your kid's ear?
Yeah. Today, I don't feel like that would go over very well, but I went to Catholic school in the 80s, so yeah, I can imagine it. Finishing his quote, I sneaked to my room, put my treasure under my pillow, and went out for another visit to the toy shop. There, I invested 6 cents in torpedoes with which I intend to astonish my schoolmates in Bethel. I could not refrain, however, from experimenting upon the guests of the hotel, which I did when they were going in to dinner. I threw 2 of the torpedoes against the wall of the hall through which the guests were passing, and the immediate results were as follows. 2 loud reports, astonished guests, irate landlord, discovery of the culprit, and summary of punishment, for the landlord immediately floored me with a single blow with his open hand and said, quote, "There, you little greenhorn, see if that will teach you better than to explode your infernal firecrackers in my house again," end quote. The lesson was sufficient, if not entirely satisfactory. I deposited the balance of the torpedoes with my gun, and as solace for my wounded feelings, I again visited the toy shop, where I bought a watch, breastpin, and top, leaving but 11 cents of my original $1. The following morning found me again at the fascinating toy shop, where I saw a beautiful knife with 2 blades, a gimlet, and a corkscrew, a whole carpenter shop in miniature, and all for 31 cents. But alas, I only had 11 cents. Have that knife I must, however, and so I proposed to the shopwoman to take back the top and breastpin at a slight deduction, and with my 11 cents to let me have the knife. The kind creature consented, and this makes memorable my first swap. Some fine and nearly white molasses candy then caught my eye, and I proposed to trade the watch for its equivalent in candy. The transaction was made, and the candy was so delicious that before night my gun was absorbed in the same way. The next morning, the torpedoes went off in the same direction, and before night even, my beloved knife was similarly exchanged. My money and my goods all gone. I traded 2 pocket handkerchiefs and an extra pair of stockings I was sure I should not want for 9 more rolls of molasses candy, and then wandered around the city, disconsolate, sighing, because there was no more molasses candy to conquer. End quote. Dude, I feel like this is the man after my own heart. Blew all his money at the toy store, then saw the candy store, gave up all his worldly goods for all the candy, then ate it all and was left with nothing. It's good.
There's a lesson to be learned there, I think.
I think. I'm hungry. All right. The second story is pretty infamous and more about his family, and I think it shows where the love for humbug comes from. It looks like it ran in the family. So from a very early age, his parents and grandparents had started to tell him that he was the heir to a remarkable piece of property called Ivy Island. This piece of land was described to him as a lush, magical paradise, a piece of land so special that young Phineas felt like royalty just knowing it belonged to him. The family hyped it up relentlessly. Even the neighbors seemed to be somewhat reverent toward PT. They'd say things like, "Someday, Phineas, you'll be a wealthy landowner," and "Ivy Island is going to make you a very important man." So as you can imagine, little Phineas couldn't wait to see this legendary inheritance. Finally, one day, when he was around 10 years old, his family took him to see Ivy Island. The moment was built up to feel like a grand unveiling, like he was about to lay eyes on his future empire. But when they arrived, what he saw was not exactly what he had in mind. Ivy Island turned out to be a patch of swampy, overgrown land with barely any value at all. It wasn't some magical kingdom. It was a joke that his family had built up for years, and even their friends and neighbors had been in on it. Barnum later said this was his first real lesson in what assholes his parents were. No, he didn't say that. He later said this was his first real lesson in the power of humbug. His family had built up Ivy Island into something really extraordinary using nothing but words and imagination, and while it may have been disappointing in the moment, the experience did stick with him because it made him realize that people will believe almost anything if you make it sound exciting enough or scary enough. And I think we can agree that's a lesson that he would be using repeatedly in his career.
I think, if I remember correctly in the book, he says when he was there on Ivy Island in the swamp and he saw a black snake, and then he came back and told his parents that he met one of his renters.
I love it.
Another not so fun fact, I think we all know this kind of stories or jokes when we're speaking of the past where we say, oh, back then a wood splinter would kill you, or stepping on a rusty nail would have been the end of you. I mean, obviously that's true, as there was no vaccination for tetanus, for example, but we rather rarely come across cases where this happened, but it did happen, and it did happen to Barnum's grandmother, Betsy Taylor. She indeed died after stepping on a rusty nail, which led to a fatal infection. Unfortunately, more tragedy struck in September of 1825 when Barnum was just 15 years old. His father, Philo, died at the age of only 48, leaving the family in a rather precarious financial situation. And as the oldest son, P.T. Barnum was expected to help support his mother and his siblings. The youngest sibling at the time was only 7 years old. P.T. took on odd jobs, working as a clerk in various shops, all while dreaming of bigger and better things. And it was during these years that he developed an early dislike for manual labor, often joking, or not so much joking, that he was, quote, better suited for thinking than working, end quote. And interestingly, even as a teenager, Barnum had a sense of humor about his circumstances because he later claimed that he, quote, hated being poor almost as much as he hated shoveling manure, end quote. He didn't want to just get by, he wanted to make it big, and he wasn't afraid to dream beyond the dirt roads of Bethel. Around this time, Barnum's shrewdness started to shine because he started to run lotteries, which were at the time legal in Connecticut. And he organized small community events, always figuring out how to turn profit on those. He even found ways to charge people for simple amusements like seeing his stuffed monkey or watching him perform tricks. If there was a coin to be made, young Phineas would definitely find it. By the time Barnum reached his late teens, he was already thinking about how to escape this small-town life of Bethel. He wanted wealth, he wanted fame, he wanted success, and more than anything, he wanted to entertain people. No, I think more than anything, he wanted to take money out of people's pockets, actually.
That's right.
But before he could become the master showman we know of today, he'd have to face a few failures and some serious controversy, but I think we are getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, because first we need to talk about Charity Hallett, a young tailoress he met sometime in 1826. And P.T. beautifully describes the first time he meets this lovely young woman, saying, quote, "One Saturday evening during a violent thundershower, Miss Mary Wheeler, a milliner, sent me word that there was a girl from Bethel at her house who had come up on horseback to get a new bonnet, that she was afraid to go back alone, and if I was going to Bethel that evening, she wished me to escort her customer. I assented and went over to Aunt Russia's house, where I was introduced to Cherry, or Charity Hallett, a fair, rosy-cheeked, buxom girl with beautiful white teeth. I assisted her to her saddle, and, mounting my own horse, we trotted toward Bethel. My first impressions of this girl as I saw her at the house were exceedingly favorable. As soon as we started, I began a conversation with her, and, finding her very affable, I regretted that the distance to Bethel was not 5 miles instead of 1. A flash of lightning gave me a distinct view of the face of my fair companion, and then I wished the distance was 20 miles. End quote. So, let's talk about this young woman who had charmed P.T. right from the start. It's so sweet, isn't it? Charity M. Hallett, the woman who would become P.T. Barnum's wife and in many, many ways his anchor throughout his larger-than-life career. Charity doesn't get much attention in the history books, but her influence on Barnum was significant, and we think she deserves a little bit of attention. She was born on October 28, 1808, in Bethel, Connecticut, to Benjamin Wright Hallett and Hannah Sturgis. Not much is known about her family. I read somewhere that Benjamin was a farmer and Hannah a homemaker, but we do know that Charity came from a modest but stable household. If you watched The Greatest Showman with Hugh Jackman, you're probably starting to notice some major discrepancies by now. Anyhow, according to Ancestry, we can also assume that Charity had at least 2 siblings, a brother and a sister. Like many women of her time, Charity learned practical skills early in life, and as we already mentioned, she worked as a tailoress, a skilled and respectable profession. Charity's upbringing in Bethel was simple and quiet, perfect preparation for a life with someone as ambitious and unpredictable as P.T. Barnum.
She's gonna have the complete opposite for the rest of her life. Simple and quiet was no more.
No more. When Barnum met Charity, he was immediately drawn to her kindness and calm demeanor, which stood in stark contrast to his own restless ambitions. If Barnum was the showman always dreaming of something bigger, Charity was the grounding force that kept him tethered to reality. Their courtship seems to have been relatively straightforward, especially for someone like Barnum, who was known for his flair for the dramatic. There's no record of any grand gestures or elaborate proposals, just a young couple falling in love in small-town Connecticut. It's refreshing, really. While Barnum would go on to orchestrate some of the most extravagant spectacles of the 19th century, his courtship and relationship with Charity was rooted in simplicity and affection.
Maybe that's also a sign of how serious he took her and his feelings for her.
I think so. That wasn't humbug. That was real.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And when we say humbug, we mean humbug is like deception, tomfoolery. So when Scrooge says bah humbug, he's saying Christmas is a bunch of nonsense. It's a bunch of bunk, you know. So yeah, the two were married on November 8th, 1829 in a modest ceremony. And at the time, Barnum was still figuring out his path in life. He hadn't yet amassed any kind of fame or fortune. He was just a young man with big dreams and a knack for the hustle. Charity, it seems, wasn't just his wife. She was his first real partner, someone who believed in him even when his plans were more ambitious than realistic. The early years of their marriage were far from glamorous. Barnum took on various odd jobs to support them, from running a general store to organizing community events. Charity likely helped manage the household during these uncertain times, providing the stability that Barnum needed as he experimented with different business ventures. She was also known for being patient and level-headed, which, let's be honest, is probably what made their marriage work.
Yeah, I think the worst that could have happened to him would have been a life partner who was similar to him, like this kind of bigger than life persona with always dreaming of something bigger. I think that would have been so much drama.
Too much drama. Yeah, opposites attract for a reason. And don't be fooled. It's important that you agree on the big decisions in life, but it definitely is good to have the yin to your yang, for sure.
I have that with my husband. Do you have that with yours?
Totally.
Are you
100%.
very, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the most stable and most kind of quiet and drama-free relationships are kind of like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the yin to his yang, that was Charity for BT, or as he liked to call her, Cherry. Barnum later described her as his moral compass, someone who would quietly challenge him when his schemes got a little bit too wild. I'm sure she was like me with my husband, like, is that really necessary?
That's Paul with me.
Phineas, is that really necessary?
Do we have to do that?
Do we have to do that? Was that a right adequate reaction now or action? And trust me, that happened often. I kind of like feel she would have been one of us.
Yeah.
Little spoiler here, their marriage lasted for 44 years through all the financial struggles, through all the scandals, and eventually through Barnum's rise to fame as the greatest showman on earth. But we will talk more about all that next week, because that's when we'll talk more about Barnum's rise to fame, his success, and his most famous performers.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a lot to talk about next week and the next week.
Yeah.
It's good stuff.
I mean, how could you put his life into one episode? It's impossible.
There's too much to talk about. Yeah.
Do you have something good after 4 weeks?
I do.
Of no episode, 3 weeks? How long has it been?
Yeah. That was great, actually. So today is the first day since before Thanksgiving that I woke up with no house guests. So that's nice. Although in a week I'll miss them and want them all back again.
Yeah. Always like that.
But no, it was really wonderful. It was so nice spending so much time with family over the past couple of weeks. It was just so nice. How about you?
My something good. Well, we haven't been talking to each other and to our listeners for such a long time that there's a lot of
there's so much
things. But the first thing I want to mention this week is I had such a lovely surprise before Christmas. I'm sure we told you guys that we were kind of hurrying to get all the episodes together and then, get everything prepared, set up for the Christmas break, and that my husband was about to come home on 13th of December. And so I had a lot of stuff still to do, Christmas decoration, putting up, editing all the episodes. And Annie saw my list. I had a huge list of things and I was working through it and everything was fine. And then on 11th of December, I'm talking to my husband on the phone. And he's like, well, that's weird. The airline just sent me an email to check in, which you usually get 24 hours before your flight. And I'm like, wow, that's weird. Is it maybe because holiday traffic and there's a lot going on? And he's like, I'm not sure. I'm going to just check the email real quick. And he's like, I'm not flying on the 13th. I'm flying tomorrow. I'm coming home one day early. And I'm like, what? But it was I was so happy. It was such a nice surprise. We just completely, with all the stress and all the preparations going on, we forgot that his vacation was not starting from the 13th, but from the 12th. So yeah, that was my something good.
That was amazing.
Yeah.
That was
I'm
very
sure we're
happy.
going to talk more about everything in the upcoming episodes. We have to, kind of ration things out for the times when we don't
really
have something
do.
good happening.
Yeah. Speaking of good musicals, you know what we just went to see at the IMAX was Wicked.
How was it?
I loved it.
Yeah.
I loved it. I knew that Ariana Grande could sing Kristen Chenoweth. I knew that. I was curious to see how it would be, and it was great. She did a beautiful, beautiful job. I didn't know how Cynthia Erivo would cover Idina Menzel because I'm not familiar with Cynthia's work. And so, holy cow, can she blow the roof off? Not even a little disappointed. And they both live sang for the performance, which is always impressive. I really loved it. I loved it. I think you'll enjoy it.
Yeah, I can't wait to see it.
Paul took me to see Hugh Jackman when he was touring a few years back. Well, a few years back. It was before COVID, wasn't it? So, and that was very cool. He did a whole bunch of the songs from The Greatest Showman.
He's so talented. He's so talented. Many people think he's just this action Wolverine guy. And then when he did Greatest Showman, they were kind of surprised. But he's a singer, he's an actor, he's a dancer.
He's a big Broadway guy.
And apparently a very kind human being. And I think very drama and scandal-free, married to his wife.
No.
For a long time already.
No, they broke up.
Not anymore?
Nope. Yeah, he's in fact a little scandally right now. I don't think there's a scandal. I honestly am not entirely sure. But he and his wife... So he starred in The Music Man with Sutton Foster, and then it seems like they both divorced their spouses and are now a couple.
Man. He was with his wife for a long time.
For a very long time.
I have to follow celebrity news more closely, apparently, because I'm not up to date.
Yeah. I think there's been a lot of, because I like him or follow him, I've just been seeing a lot of stuff. And I honestly don't know. We don't know anything about the private lives of these people, but it seems like at least he didn't start anything till everything was finalized. I don't know. I just wish everyone well. But Greatest Showman the music from that is so much fun.
Yeah, I have 2 of the songs on my running playlist because they're really good.
Which ones?
Pushing you forward. Greatest Show and This Is Me.
Nice. Good.
All right. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our other episodes, please do us a huge favor. This really helps us out. Go to your podcast app and leave us a rating and or review. Check out our webpage, freshhellpodcast.com. There you find all the links to our merch store, to our Facebook group, to our Instagram, to what else? To our PO box, to our email, which is freshhellpodcast@gmail.com. You also find the link to Patreon, where we're going to keep you posted on the Fresh Hell reviews true crime. Fresh Hell After Dark. Maybe you have ideas
We're going to find a title. It's a work in progress. That's right.
Yeah. And I think that's it. Please tell your pets. We said hi, hug them, cuddle them, treat them kindly. Jem is sleeping next to me since did I tell you I have a whole office space set up now, completely new, and I'm so happy. I'm gonna tell you next time. And be kind to your fellow human beings. And most importantly, and hardest of it all, be kind to yourself.
That is the hardest part. It's winter, so clear the snow off your car. Clear it off. Don't be the problem. Don't litter. Don't tailgate. And just remember, if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye.